Fast, crossing county lines just to make my name in the city. Took everything, put it on the line, cause I never break or back down. One shot is do or die, and the odds ain't looking too pretty. But I got the feeling it's my time. I know I'm taking it now.
Good morning and welcome to the Retirement Learning Lab, where we teach people how to retire without going broke. My name is Van Richards and welcome today. Today we're going to be talking about how the coronavirus pandemic will affect Social Security and Medicare. Now, the coronavirus has actually been in the United States for about 105 days, but it was actually back on March the 19th when the World Health Organization declared it a worldwide pandemic. And really, the difference in between a pandemic and an epidemic is just an epidemic is regional. We have an epidemic going on in Texas right now. We have a pandemic that's going on a worldwide basis, and it's only been around for about 55 days. But it was actually back on January the 21st when the first traveler from Wuhan, China came to Washington State and was diagnosed at that point with the coronavirus. That's been 105 days. I know it seems like it's been a lot longer, but we're here to talk about how that pandemic is going to affect Social Security and how it's also going to affect your Medicare. Now, the pandemic has caused a lot of economic chaos. It's caused the stock markets to go crazy. It's caused businesses to shut. It's caused businesses to, it's caused businesses to slow down. And when that happens, it also affects incomes of people. And the income of people is what funds Social Security. And that's the way that we want to look at this today, is how the funding is going to be slowed down, and that is going to be a trickle-down effect. It's going to end up affecting Social Security. However, there are some things that can be done that can help mitigate the circumstances. Now, usually when people are preparing for retirement or they're in retirement, there are only 6 things that can happen. Really, there's only 6 things that can happen. Take a look at this and see what I mean. So we truly are in a perfect storm, and that's not a good situation when it comes to your retirement. The perfect storm is that all 6 of these risks are occurring at the same time. Usually, I only see 1 or 2, maybe 3 of those circumstances that happen to families, to individuals that are retiring. But we are in that terrible perfect storm where all 6 of these are happening at the same time. Now, I'll remind you as we're going through today, if you have comments, if you have questions, just type them in and I'll see them here on my screen. And as we go through them, I'll be glad to answer your questions and talk to you just a little bit and answer whatever concern that you might have. Now, I'm not here today as a fearmonger about what's going to happen. And I don't want you to go away from this with rage in your heart about what you should be doing about Social Security. What I want you to go away from today with is an understanding of what possibly could happen and how you may be able to influence that, how you can influence it on a national level and how you can influence it on a personal level. But when we're looking at Social Security, you have to understand how Social Security is actually funded. Now, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty technical aspects of it, but just from a very wide overview, the way that Social Security is funded is when you get a paycheck, part of that paycheck goes to, you probably see it, it's called FICA. It's the payroll taxes that goes towards Social Security and actually towards Medicare also. When that money goes in, it's going in at a certain rate, and that rate of money going in is what's funding the Social Security Trust Fund. Now, there's actually two trust funds. There's one which is for retirement, and there's one which is for disability. The one that we're talking about today is the one for retirement. As we see it today, we're going to see the slowdown of payroll that's going on because so many people are unemployed. And because of that slowdown in payroll, that means that there's less money going into the Social Security system. Now, at some point, not now, not next week, not next month, not even next year, but at some point, Social Security, the trust fund, will be depleted. It will be down to zero. Now, when that happens, that does not mean that Social Security income to the recipients, if you're receiving Social Security right now or you're anticipating receiving it, it does not mean that it will stop. However, you need to be aware of what may happen. And if Social Security, the funds actually run dry, it will be reduced. Right now, the way that it looks is if there was no Social Security trust fund available, Social Security checks would be cut by about 24 to 25%. Now, that can be stopped with action in Congress. It's probably not going to happen this year. And one of the reasons why it's not going to happen this year is because it's an election year, and the anticipated date for the trust fund to run out of money is 15 years from now. However, that report, which was put out by Steve Mnuchin before the coronavirus occurred, did not take into consideration the drop in funding to Social Security that we're seeing right now. There was a study which was actually done. Hold on, I'm going to tell you here in just a second who it was done by. There was a study which was done by the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College. And that research study showed that if you had just 2 months of slowdown in funding, the way that we're having it right now, just 2 months will reduce the time of the Social Security Trust Fund, the Retirement Trust Fund, of running out of money. So as we see it, when the report was done by the Treasury Department prior to the pandemic, it said that 2035 was when the Retirement Trust Fund was going to run out of money. If we readjust that because of the economic circumstances, that really means right now that we're looking at the trust fund running out of money in 2033. Now, we add 2 more months onto that, we're down to 2031. 2 more months onto that, we're down to 2029. I think you get the idea that the longer that this pandemic affects the economy, the more it's going to affect the Social Security Trust Fund. Now, the way that Social Security works is it's kind of like kiting. You may have heard of a kiting scheme, and actually in real life, those are illegal. But now since the government does it, it's fine, I guess. But it's kind of like if you saw a kite. You've ever seen kites in the sky and they are connected together? It runs from one to the next to the next. So here, let me show you exactly what I mean. So the idea is that the money from people who are working is going to be funding the people who are retired. Now, there's not enough people who are working to completely fund people who are retired. That's why that there's going to be a drop in income, and that's why Congress will have to do something that's going to take care of that problem. Now, that problem is probably going to be taken care of with some sort of a payroll tax increase. But as I mentioned, I really don't think that's going to happen right now because we're in the middle of an election year, and raising taxes in the middle of an election year for either party is not a good thing. But let's look a little bit at what might be happening now. Here are a few things that you need to keep in mind that might be happening now. Now, you'll see the very first one, and that's the reduction, the future reduction possibly in incomes because of the funding problems. But there's more. Take a look.
It's a race to the finish, only one prize. Give all your blood and passion, get it all on your desire. You fight with all your
Congress is the only entity that can help. They're the only way out of this right now. That is, if you're looking at sustaining Social Security. Now, if you're doing your own personal planning, if you're able to count on Social Security as being less of your retirement, that's a good thing. But the fact is that with people retiring, that what we see from a retirement planning standpoint is that over half of the people that are retiring actually, it's 2 out of 3 people that are retiring are depending upon half of their income to come from Social Security. So it is something that's very, very, very important. Now, today, what we're going to see is what may be happening is based on the circumstances. If you're turning, for example, if you're turning age 60 this year, you may be impacted by the coronavirus pandemic's effect on Social Security. And this is what I mean. If you're turning 60, you're not quite eligible for Social Security. You've got a few more years to go. But beginning at age 60, your wages are taken into consideration more sincerely. And the calculations are very complicated. So I'm not going to go into all the calculations other than to tell you that if you're turning 60, if Congress does not fund your Social Security, you will have it permanently reduced when you do get to 62 or beyond, whenever you do decide to take Social Security. Now, there is a fix. That fix is Congress steps in and says, oh, okay, we're going to take care of this. And actually, let's just look at a little bit of the problem that occurs. When you become 60, so that you understand this and you know how to talk about it, when you turn 60, the consumer price index is what's used to calculate your Social Security income. If the consumer price index, the consumer wages, are lower in the year that you are having your calculation done, where the calculations begin, then your income is permanently reduced. Now, it happened one time before. I believe it was actually, if I'm looking at my notes correctly, it was back in 1975. No, this was actually back in 1980 when that, or 2016. I'll get that correct. In 2016, it happened once before. That's when Congress had to step in and add extra funding to take care of the problem. So Congress can help take care of the problem. And this is one of these things that you need to be in contact with your political leaders, your congressmen, your senators, and you need to tell them, I'm worried about the fact that I'm turning 60 this year and my Social Security may be reduced because of the lower wages that's used to calculate my Social Security. That's basically what would happen. And if you want to run this back on the replay, you'll hear that and you can write it down. And if you're speaking to someone about it, you'll understand a little bit better of how that's going to work. Now, another thing that's going to happen is there's probably, I would say more than probably, there's not going to be a cost of living adjustment this year. The cost of living adjustment is based on the fact that goods are going up in cost, and based on that, Social Security goes up a little bit. When Social Security doesn't go up, that means that it's stable. And it really, for a lot of people, if they're not spending as much money, then that probably isn't as much as a problem. But a lot of people who are relying upon Social Security live on a very thin line. So they do depend upon every dollar that comes in. So just be aware that you probably will not have a cost of living adjustment this year. Now, the cost of living adjustment, the other item that you saw listed earlier that is affected is Medicare. And the cost of living adjustment actually does have an effect on Medicare premiums. How that works is that if there is not a cost of living adjustment, people with higher incomes, probably about 30% of the population, will see higher premiums. They could actually be much higher premiums. Now, this actually happened one time before, and what happened is Congress stepped in again, and they borrowed money. They allowed the Treasury Department to lend Medicare money to help lower the premiums. No, it wasn't a permanent thing. So if you are a higher income earner, it would probably be in your best interest to consider that you're going to have higher Medicare premiums in this particular year. Now, as we went through all this different information, you saw that the only way that a lot of these problems can be solved is with Congress. And the problems that we're seeing right now can't be fixed because there's people that are not in the position to solve the problems. With Social Security, there are actually public trustees that help guide and give direction to the entity, but those have not been in place for 5 years. I want to give you a couple of different names so that you understand what's happening right now. You may have heard that nominations that have been made by the president are being stalled in Congress, more precisely being stalled in the Senate. And the public trustees for Social Security are an exact example of this. The two trustees that have been nominated by the president can't get to the floor to get voted on because of all the delays that goes on. This is something that should happen in an hour. The people that are nominated for these positions are actually going to help guide Social Security. So if you want to do something, communicate with your senators and tell them to please vote, bring to the floor, bring to the vote the public trustees for Social Security. It was actually back in 2019 that the White House nominated James Lockhart as a nominee for a public trustee, and it's never made it to the floor for a vote. So he needs to go to the floor for a vote. But probably one of the reasons why that this gentleman was taking so long is he's a Republican. James Lockhart is. Now, to help balance things out, President Trump did name a Democrat to the trustees position also. Actually, William Douster was nominated in February before a lot of this problem took place. This is a situation where Congress can agree on what they should be doing. There's problems that are going to happen, the ones that I've mentioned earlier in the broadcast, that are going to be happening. And if they're not addressed, it's going to become a serious problem. So what it's important to understand is, rather than leaving the broadcast today and being enraged with what should happen or being scared of what may happen, there's two things that you can do. One thing that you can do is, if you have the financial capability, you can plan on how to have lower income from Social Security, and you can plan on how to have money come from other places. Now, that may happen. It may be a long time off, but the idea is to keep it in mind. If you also are counting on a cost of living adjustment, you need to plan that in your income, perhaps be a little bit more frugal in how you're spending. And actually, if you need a budget, I'm going to give you a free tool. If you go to my website, which is richardsfinancialplanning.com, and you go all the way down to the bottom, you're going to see a tab that says Forms. And on the forms, there's a form that you can fill out that is a budget. It's about 3 or 4 pages. So if you need to think, all right, how can I get a better handle on how I'm spending money? That's a good place to start. Start with a budget. So that's one of the things that you can do. One of the other things that you can do is you can reach out to your elected officials and you can let them know, A, I'm concerned if I turn 60 in this particular year that my income is going to be reduced with Social Security. B, I'm concerned that Social Security is going to be reduced in the future if you don't do something about the funding. Or C, I'm concerned about my Medicare premiums that are going to be reduced because of a lack of a cost of living adjustment. These are all things that you can clearly communicate and say, can you tell me what's your position on this? What are you doing about it? And then D, the last thing is, you can say, when are you going to vote on the public trustees? When are the trustees going to be brought up for a vote? Now, that only happens in the Senate. So contacting your senators, the route to go there. Of course, you can bring it up to your representatives because they can always put a word in the ear of the senators that they communicate with on a regular basis. Well, those are the things that we have to talk about with the coronavirus and with Social Security and with Medicare for today. And I just want to bring up a couple of different questions that I've run across this particular week, things that people have asked and written in about. And I'll take a moment or two and talk about those just for a second. If you have any questions and you want to ask them today, just type them in. I'm glad to sit here for a moment or two and answer questions. If you're watching this on a replay, you can type questions in, and throughout the week, I'll monitor those and answer those as well. But two particular questions came in this week that were very interesting. One was from an individual that has high yield tax-free bonds, and they were concerned and because of the decreases in value. And they asked my opinion about how that might be working toward the future. My opinion on high yield tax-free bonds, let me explain to you how that works. Remember, a bond is a loan, and it's a loan usually either to a business or to a municipality. When you have tax-free bonds, those are only with municipalities. And the problem with high yield tax-free bonds is they are paying a little bit more interest, but the way that they get the higher interest is they go for higher risk bonds. Now, what we're seeing with lower funding in the economy is that there are many municipalities that may have problems in the future. And what some states, what some senators, and what some congressmen have done is they have brought up the fact that part of the bailout should be to help the states that are having financial difficulties. Some people in Congress disagree with that because the problems that were there with these municipalities, they existed prior to the coronavirus pandemic. So another thought has been floated that perhaps some of these municipalities, even states, should consider bankruptcy. Just recently, the state of California borrowed money from the trust department to pay for expenses. In the future, we could see some problems with the municipalities that have higher risk, the high yields. So that may cause decreases in value. It hasn't hit the markets yet, but if you have high yield municipal bonds or high yield municipal bond funds, I would suggest that you monitor them very, very carefully because the risk has increased because of the possibility that those municipalities could stop paying interest in the future. So keep that in mind. Now, the second question that came up this week had to do with health insurance. And I know a little bit about health insurance because I spent a long time in the health insurance business. And the question that came up was about the health sharing ministries. Health sharing ministries are usually religious organizations that pool money from its members to help each other to pay for their medical bills. And I think it's a wonderful effort. It's a wonderful thought that Christians are pulling together to help pay each other's expenses. Now, the problem with health sharing ministries that we're going to see is that if there are more people that are making claims because they're sick, then the possibility of them sharing higher cost onto its members is quite high. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't buy into a health sharing ministry. I think they're a wonderful idea. But understand that health sharing ministries are different from health insurance. Health insurance has reserves available to help pay for expenses if they run out of money. Health sharing ministries do not have reserves. They have a limited amount of money. Basically, they're taking money from current members that are helping to pay for other members. So be very cautious. Your premiums may fluctuate considerably in the future. Check on the stability and on the claims paying ability. Ask the representative of that company about the claims paying ability of that health sharing ministry to pay bills. All right. Well, that comes to the very end of today's broadcast. I want to remind you that if you have questions during the week, and if you're listening to this on a replay, be sure and type them in and we'll get back to you. And if you are around next Tuesday, 11 a.m., make sure that you tune in, bring your questions, and we'll be able to answer them live here on the internet. Have a great week.